It was late summer. The air was heavy with that dry heat you only get after weeks without rain, and the sky was the kind of washed-out blue that makes you think there's nothing in the world to worry about. My plan was simple: drive up to the trailhead, take the ridge path for a few miles, and be back before the afternoon sun dipped low. I had been on that ridge before, but only the first section. This time, I wanted to push farther, see what was past the bend where the trail disappears into the thicker trees. The drive out was uneventful, winding through two-lane country roads lined with yellowed grass. Every so often, a patch of pines threw shade across the cracked asphalt. The air coming through my open windows was warm, smelling faintly of dust and the faintly sweet scent of dry weeds. I parked in the small dirt lot by the trailhead. There were only two other vehicles there: an older SUV with mud caked on the tires, and a small silver hatchback that looked like it hadn't been driven in days. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and looked around. The lot sat at the edge of a wide valley, the trail climbing steadily up the ridge that rose on the far side. From here, I could see the dry outlines of deer tracks in the dirt, a scattering of pine needles, and the bright white flash of the trail sign nailed to a weathered post. No other hikers in sight. I locked my car, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The first mile was the easy part. The trail rose in a steady incline, the dirt packed firm under my boots. The trees here were spaced apart, mostly pines and a few stubborn oaks that twisted upward in odd angles. Between them, I could see glimpses of the valley floor below, where the road snaked off into the distance. My footsteps crunched softly on the trail, the only real sound besides the low drone of insects somewhere in the grass. After 20 minutes, I reached the ridge's first overlook. It wasn't much, just a flat rock that jutted out far enough for a clear view, but the drop was steep. I stood there for a while, drinking from my bottle, letting the sun warm my shoulders. The wind was faint, only moving the tops of the trees. From here, the trail narrowed. This was where most people turned around. At least that's what I remembered from last time. But I kept going, curious about what lay beyond. The trees closed in quickly. Within another 5 minutes, I was under almost full shade. The dirt here was softer, scattered with pine cones and brittle twigs. The air was cooler, but it carried a faint smell of something old, like damp wood and leaves that had been sitting for too long. I noticed how quiet it had become. The insect noise faded, and I could no longer hear the distant hum of the valley road. The path dipped slightly, then rose again in a sharp curve. I followed it, stepping over a fallen branch. Around the bend, the trail widened into a narrow clearing. There were no signs, no markers, just an opening in the trees where the ground was bare except for a scattering of small rocks. I stopped here, looking around. Something about the place felt not wrong exactly, but out of place. The air was still. Even the leaves overhead didn't move. I adjusted my pack and kept walking. The further I went, the less maintained the trail felt. Roots crossed the path like twisted ropes, forcing me to step high or go around. In some places, brush had grown in from the sides, scratching my arms if I didn't hold it back. The slope became uneven, forcing me to watch every step. I checked my watch just past noon. I had plenty of daylight left. The plan was still fine. I rounded another curve, and the ground under my boot shifted slightly. I froze, looking down. The dirt here was loose, as if something had dug through it recently. It wasn't a big section, just enough to notice. Maybe an animal. I stepped carefully, testing the ground before putting my full weight down. Past this spot, the trail climbed again. I was breathing harder now, sweat sticking my shirt to my back. I paused halfway up, leaning against a tree. The bark was rough under my palm. I could hear my own breathing loud in my ears. Then, faintly, something else. It was a sound I almost didn't notice, soft, irregular, like something moving in the brush off to my left. I turned my head, but all I could see were trees and shadows. I waited, holding still. Nothing. Just the faint shift of a branch as if from wind, though there was no wind here. I shook it off and kept walking. The ridge leveled out after another 10 minutes, and the trail opened again, though the trees still pressed close on either side. I thought about turning back here, I had already come farther than I planned. But something made me keep going, a stubborn need to see what was ahead. The first sign of real trouble came about half a mile later. The trail split, not an official fork, just where a narrow, rough-looking track broke off to the right. I stopped, scanning the ground. The smaller path looked used, but not often. Grass grew between patches of dirt, and a few fresh-looking scuffs marked the edges, like someone had stepped there recently. I don't know why I didn't just ignore it and stick to the main trail. Instead, I stepped onto the smaller path. This track was worse. Narrow, uneven, the ground sloping sharply in places. The air here smelled different, sharper somehow, with a faint metallic tang I couldn't place. I moved slower, watching for holes or loose stones. The sound of my boots on the dirt was loud. 100 yards in, I noticed something strange. The ground ahead was marked, wide, uneven impressions pressed into the dirt. Too big for deer, too wide for boots. Some were shallow, others deeper, as if the weight that made them had shifted. They ran along the path, then veered off into the trees. I stood there for a moment, staring at them. My stomach felt tight, though I couldn't explain why. Animals leave tracks all the time. Still, something about these made me uneasy. I kept going, but slower now, my senses sharper. The path ended abruptly at a small drop, a dry creek bed maybe 6 feet down. The dirt here was loose, the banks crumbling. I crouched to look, and that's when I saw it. Near the bottom of the creek bed, half buried in the dirt, was a torn piece of fabric. Faded blue, frayed at the edges, and dirty enough that it might have been here for weeks. Next to it, just visible under a layer of leaves, something pale. I slid down carefully, brushing the leaves away. It was a shoe, mud-caked, laces missing, the sole partly detached. The kind of thing someone might lose if they'd been running hard. Cold feeling spread through me. I looked around, scanning the creek bed. On the far bank, there were more impressions in the dirt, drag marks, uneven and scattered, leading back into the trees. I didn't like how far I'd gone from the main trail. I decided then to head back. Climbing out of the creek bed was harder than I expected. The loose dirt slid under my boots, and I had to grab at roots to pull myself up. My hands came away gritty, my nails packed with soil. I stood there at the top for a moment, breathing hard. That's when I heard it again. Movement, closer this time, in the brush ahead. Slow, deliberate, not the quick darting of a deer or squirrel. I could hear twigs snapping under weight. I froze. My skin prickled, every sound amplified. The noise stopped. I took a careful step backward, keeping my eyes on the trees. Then another. My heart was pounding. A branch shifted just a fraction, and I saw a shape. Not clear, not enough to make out details, but it was there, still upright, watching. I turned and walked quickly back toward the main trail. By the time I reached it, my breathing was ragged. The air felt heavier now, the silence deeper. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the path behind me was empty. The walk back should have been easier. It was downhill, but it felt endless. Every sound in the brush made me tense. More than once, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, faint but matching my pace. Each time I stopped, they stopped. My mouth was dry, and I could taste the metallic tang of fear. When I finally reached the first overlook, I didn't stop. I didn't look at the view. I kept moving, pushing myself to cover the last mile as fast as I could without running. My calves burned, but I didn't care. The parking lot came into view, and I felt a wave of relief until I saw the SUV was gone. My car sat alone. I didn't waste time. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. Just at the edge of the trees, far up the trail, something moved back into the shadows. I didn't go back to that ridge again, not because of the heat or the difficulty, but because I still don't know who or what was watching me that day. I only know that if I'd gone another mile, maybe even another half mile, I might not have come back at all. I had been planning the hike for weeks. The idea was simple: spend 2 days covering a long ridge trail in the high country, camp overnight near the halfway point, and return by the same route. It wasn't one of the famous trails that drew crowds. This was one of those places that only showed up if you studied local maps carefully. The ridge had a reputation for being quiet, almost forgotten, with long stretches where you might not see another person for hours. That was part of the attraction. The weather was perfect that morning. Cool air, thin clouds scattered across the sky, and the sun still low enough to cast long shadows over the land. I parked my car at the small dirt pull-off that served as the trailhead, checked my gear twice, and tightened the straps of my pack. I had enough food, water, and supplies for 2 days, and I felt prepared. The first section of the trail climbed steadily through dense forest. The smell of pine was strong, and the air was damp from the previous night's rain. The soil under my boots was soft and dark, and here and there I had to step over fallen branches slick with moisture. I kept my pace slow to avoid sweating too early in the day. After about 45 minutes, the trail reached a steep switchback where the trees began to thin. I could see glimpses of the valley floor far below, a patchwork of green fields and winding rivers. The higher I climbed, the more the view opened up until the forest gave way entirely to the exposed ridge. The air here was cooler, and the wind moved steadily over the open ground. The ridge trail itself was narrow, no more than a worn strip of dirt and rock, with steep drops on either side. To the left, the slope fell sharply into a wide basin thick with dark trees. To the right, the drop was more sheer, a rocky wall that seemed to plunge endlessly down toward the valley. The path wound along the crest, curving gently with the shape of the ridge. It was beautiful and a little unsettling. There was no sound except the wind and the crunch of my boots on gravel. No birdsong, no rustling in the brush, just the constant low hiss of air moving over the ridge. The silence made me more aware of my own movements. Every step felt louder than it should have. I passed no one. No footprints in the dirt looked fresh, and no signs of other hikers appeared. The trail felt abandoned in a way that was both peaceful and slightly unnerving. By midday, I reached a rocky outcrop that jutted slightly over the drop. I sat there for a while, eating lunch and watching shadows crawl slowly across the valley below. The wind pushed steadily against my back, and I found myself leaning forward without thinking, as if some part of me wanted to resist its pressure. After resting, I continued along the ridge. The terrain shifted from bare rock to stretches of low, twisted shrubs that rattled softly in the breeze. The sun was higher now, and the light felt sharper, the shadows deeper. I noticed the air was drying my lips, so I drank from my bottle and kept moving. It was about 3 in the afternoon when I reached the halfway point where I had planned to camp. The spot was a slightly wider section of the ridge, a shallow saddle between 2 high points. A stand of wind-bent pines clung stubbornly to the slope on the leeward side, offering a little shelter from the constant gusts. I found a flat patch of ground among them and began setting up my tent. I took my time with camp chores, staking the tent, unrolling my sleeping pad, arranging my pack so I could reach food easily later. I boiled water for dinner and ate slowly, watching the sky change color as the sun dropped lower. That's when I first noticed something strange. It started as a faint, irregular vibration through the ground. At first I thought it might be the wind shaking the trees, but when I put my hand flat on the dirt, I could feel a dull, rhythmic tremor. It wasn't strong, but it was steady enough to notice. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I sat still for a long time, listening. The ridge was silent again except for the wind. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a distant rock slide or some logging work far away. Still, the feeling of it lingered in my mind. As darkness settled, the temperature dropped quickly. I pulled on extra layers and crawled into my tent. The wind rose and fell in waves, making the tent fabric ripple. I lay there for a while, just listening, before eventually drifting into a light sleep. I woke sometime in the night to a sound that didn't belong to the wind. It was faint at first, a dull thud spaced several seconds apart. It reminded me of someone stepping heavily on hollow ground. Each sound seemed to come from a slightly different spot, but always from somewhere along the ridge above my camp. I froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped. I waited, my heart beating fast, but nothing followed. I told myself it could have been rocks shifting or branches falling, but I couldn't ignore how deliberate the spacing had seemed. I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, the wind had eased, and the air was cold and still. I made coffee, packed my gear, and started back along the ridge toward the trailhead. The first few hours passed quietly, but as I neared the highest point of the ridge, I noticed something ahead on the trail. At first it looked like a small boulder, but as I approached, I saw it was a backpack. It was lying partly on its side, the straps twisted, as if it had been dropped or thrown down. It looked weathered, dirty fabric, some fraying seams, but not ruined. There was no one around. I scanned the ridge in both directions, seeing only empty trail. I didn't touch the pack at first, just circled it slowly, trying to make sense of it. When I finally crouched to look closer, I saw the zipper was halfway open. Inside were a few crumpled food wrappers, a dented metal bottle, and a torn piece of rain cover. No ID, no phone, nothing that could tell me whose it was. I stood there longer than I should have, feeling uneasy. The pack looked like it had been out here for days, maybe weeks, but it was still strange for it to be right in the middle of the trail. I left it where it was and kept moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it faint noises that were hard to place. A quick scrape like boot on stone, a muffled thump that seemed too heavy for falling debris. I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, scanning the edges of the ridge. The trail wound around a rocky shoulder, and when I came around it, I froze. About 30 yards ahead, partly hidden by a stand of scrub, was another pack. This one was upright, leaning against a boulder as if placed there deliberately. I didn't go near it. I just kept walking, forcing myself not to speed up. My skin felt tight, and my stomach had that hollow, weightless feeling I get when something is very wrong. The rest of the hike became a blur of constant scanning, quick steps, and the urge to be anywhere but on that ridge. I never saw anyone. I never heard footsteps close behind me, but the feeling never left until I reached my car and locked the doors. I reported what I found to the local ranger station. They said they'd send someone to check it out, and they asked for my contact information. A week later, I got a call. They'd found both packs, but no sign of anyone nearby. They wouldn't say more, only that the matter was under investigation. I haven't been back to that ridge since. I still think about the tremor under the ground, the noises in the night, and those packs left like markers on the trail. Something happened up there, something I don't want to understand too closely. And I know that if I ever go back, I'll be walking with the same silence pressing against me, waiting to hear the next sound that doesn't belong. I had planned the hike for weeks. It was supposed to be one of those long, quiet days in the mountains where you move at your own pace, stop when you want, and let your thoughts settle into the rhythm of walking. The ridge trail was remote, running along the spine of a long mountain chain, far from the more popular trails. According to the map, it climbed steeply for the first couple of miles, leveled out along a narrow ridge with drop-offs on either side, and then wound down through a long forested valley before looping back to the trailhead. I had checked the weather the night before. Clear skies, mild temperatures, and only a light breeze expected. Perfect. I packed enough food for the whole day, plenty of water, a first aid kit, an extra layer, and my phone, though I knew there wouldn't be much signal. My pack felt just heavy enough to remind me I was carrying it, but not enough to slow me down. I started early, just after sunrise. The air was cool and damp, smelling faintly of pine and earth. The trail began in a quiet patch of forest, the ground soft with fallen needles. My boots made almost no sound as I moved forward. The only noises came from small birds waking in the trees and the occasional creak of branches swaying above me. The climb was steady but not brutal at first. Sunlight began to filter through the branches, throwing thin, golden lines across the trail. I fell into a rhythm. Step, breathe, step, breathe, letting my thoughts drift. My mind was blank except for the awareness of my body moving. I felt good. About 40 minutes in, the incline became steeper. The trail turned rocky, and my boots scraped against stone as I climbed. Sweat started to bead on my forehead. I stopped for a drink, adjusted my pack straps, and kept going. The forest here grew thinner, the trees spaced wider apart, and I could catch glimpses of the mountainside falling away below. By the time I reached the ridge, my shirt clung slightly to my back. The view opened up completely. On my left, the land dropped sharply into a valley where a thin ribbon of river wound its way through a patchwork of dark forest and pale meadows. On my right, another valley stretched out, more rugged, filled with jagged rock formations. The ridge itself was only about 20 feet wide in places, and the trail cut right through the middle. The wind was stronger up here, rushing over the ridge and tugging lightly at my clothes. I paused to take it in, pulling out a granola bar. The air was so clear that I could see for miles. I stood there for a long time, chewing slowly, the taste of oats and honey mixing with the cold air in my mouth. When I started walking again, I noticed the ridge trail wasn't perfectly smooth. It rose and dipped, sometimes climbing over small rock outcrops, sometimes dropping into shallow saddles. The ground was uneven, scattered with loose stones that shifted underfoot if I wasn't careful. An hour later, the trail dipped into a narrow saddle where a cluster of scrubby bushes grew. As I stepped through them, I noticed a faint noise behind me, a sharp crack, like a rock shifting or snapping under weight. I froze. The wind was loud up here, but the sound had been close, just a few feet behind me. I turned slowly, scanning the ridge I had just crossed. Nothing moved. The trail was empty, stretching back toward the last rise I had climbed over. I stood there for a few seconds longer, listening. Nothing, just the wind rushing past my ears. I told myself it was probably a rock dislodged by the wind or maybe a small animal. I started walking again, but the same thing happened about 10 minutes later. I had just climbed over another rise when I heard it. Another sharp crack, this time followed by the faint scrape of stone on stone. I stopped again, my skin prickling. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the trail behind me. But again, it was empty. Something about the sound was different from the random noises of the mountain. It wasn't a bird hopping along a branch or a pine cone dropping. It was heavy, deliberate. Something solid was moving on the rocks. I kept walking, but now I was hyper-aware of every sound. My breathing seemed louder than before, my boots striking the trail more heavily. The wind came in bursts, and each time it died down, I strained to hear behind me. After a while, the trail began to descend from the ridge into a narrow chute of rock. The walls rose steeply on either side, funneling me down toward the valley. The space felt tight, with only a strip of pale sky above. My footsteps echoed faintly here. Halfway down, I heard it again. This time, it was unmistakable. A rock clattering loose somewhere above and behind me. My heart thumped harder in my chest. The sound had weight to it, like something bigger than a deer or mountain goat. I didn't stop to look this time. I kept moving, faster now, trying to keep my steps quiet but failing. The chute ended in a dense stand of trees. The forest swallowed the wind, making the air feel still and heavy. The quiet here was almost worse than the noise on the ridge. The trail twisted between trunks, the ground covered in a thick layer of needles that muffled my steps. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. Once, I thought I caught movement between the trees, a quick, dark shift. But when I stared, there was nothing there. I told myself to focus on reaching the halfway point. There was a small creek marked on the map, and I figured I'd stop there, eat, and calm down. But the farther I walked, the more certain I became that I was not alone. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and every so often, a twig would snap somewhere just out of sight. By the time I reached the creek, my throat was dry, but I wasn't sure if it was from thirst or tension. I crouched by the water, filling my bottle and taking a long drink. My hand shook slightly as I screwed the cap back on. I decided not to linger. The trail from here climbed again, switchbacking up toward another section of ridge. My legs were starting to feel the miles, but adrenaline kept me moving. I was listening constantly now, and the sounds behind me were no longer isolated. They were steady, keeping pace. Sometimes I heard them closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. When I reached the second ridge, the terrain became more open again. I thought maybe I'd be able to see what was following me, but the trail curved and dipped too much. Each time I stopped and turned, the ridge behind me was empty. It was late afternoon by the time I started the final descent toward the trailhead. The light was turning golden, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the path. I kept moving quickly, resisting the urge to break into a run. Running would burn my energy too fast, and I didn't want to make noise. The last mile was the worst. I could hear the footsteps behind me clearly now, slow, steady, and deliberate. They stopped when I stopped. They started when I started. My skin crawled with the certainty that whoever or whatever it was, they had been there for hours, keeping the same distance, never revealing themselves. I saw the parking lot through the trees before I heard the footsteps stop for the last time. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sound. I didn't look back. I walked straight to my car, unlocked it with shaking hands, and climbed inside. When I finally did glance in the rearview mirror, the trail was empty. Just still trees and the last light of the day fading on the ridge. I never saw who was there, but I know they were. I had been planning this hike for weeks. It wasn't the kind of trail you found in tourist brochures or social media posts. It was an old, overgrown route I had read about in a hiking forum, buried deep in a discussion thread that had been inactive for years. The photos that were still visible showed narrow dirt paths lined with tall grass, weather-worn rocks, and stretches of forest where sunlight barely made it to the ground. According to a few comments, the trail had fallen out of use because it was too rough and poorly maintained. To me, that was an invitation. I packed the night before. My backpack was heavier than usual because I was going alone, and that meant bringing every bit of gear I might possibly need. First aid kit, spare clothes, rain shell, water purifier, extra food, power bank, and a heavier flashlight than the small one I usually carried. I also brought an old map I'd printed from the forum thread. It was blurry and barely readable, but it was the only reference to this particular trail I had. I had marked the starting point and 2 possible exits, though one of them was supposedly blocked by a rockslide years ago. I woke up before sunrise, ate a heavy breakfast, and drove 2 hours to the trailhead. The road was rough and ended in a small dirt clearing surrounded by weeds. There was no official signpost, just a faded wooden post with nothing on it. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and pine needles. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I could hear water dripping from the trees. I tightened the straps on my pack, adjusted my boots, and started walking. The first section was surprisingly easy. The dirt path was narrow but clear, and the forest around me was still. I could hear birds calling somewhere higher in the trees and the faint sound of running water to my right. The air was cool, and each breath I took felt fresh. I passed over a couple of small wooden footbridges that looked aged but stable, their planks dark from moisture. After about an hour, the trail began to climb. Roots crossed the path, some as thick as my arm, forcing me to step high or use my hands for balance. The forest floor here was damp, covered in layers of decomposing leaves. I noticed the air was cooler, and a light mist lingered between the trees. The canopy overhead was thicker, blocking most of the sunlight. I pulled out the map to check my progress, but the markings were vague, just a faint red line sketched over contour lines. The only way to know if I was on track was to keep following what looked like a trail. 2 hours in, I reached a clearing. It was a small, grassy area no more than 20 feet across. In the center was an old, weathered post with the remnants of a sign nailed to it. The lettering had faded so much it was unreadable, just dark stains on gray wood. The path split here. One way continued uphill, the other dipped into a darker section of forest. The map wasn't clear about which route to take, but based on the direction of the sun and the contour lines, I decided to keep climbing. The incline grew steeper. My legs began to burn, and sweat collected under my jacket. I stopped a couple of times to drink water and steady my breathing. The trail was less defined here. Grass and small plants had begun to grow over it, and in places it looked more like an animal track than a hiking path. I had to keep scanning ahead to spot where it picked up again. Once or twice, I thought I had lost it entirely, only to find a faint depression in the soil or a broken branch that hinted at human passage. Around noon, clouds began to gather. They moved fast, blocking out the sun and making the forest noticeably darker. The temperature dropped enough for me to see my breath. I pulled on my gloves and kept going, aware that if rain started, the climb would become a lot more difficult. That's when I first noticed something was off. The wind, which had been rustling leaves above, suddenly stopped. The forest went quiet, not completely silent, but the bird calls and distant water sounds seemed to fade. I told myself it was just the weather changing, but it gave me a strange, uneasy feeling. I walked faster, partly to warm up and partly to shake off the thought. Half an hour later, I came across something unexpected. A boot print in the mud. It was fresh, edges sharp, tread clear. It looked recent, maybe within the last day. At first, I felt relieved. If someone else had been here, it meant I was probably still on a real trail. But the relief faded when I noticed there was only one print, not a series. I looked around for more but found nothing. It was as if someone had stepped here once and vanished. I told myself I was overthinking it and kept climbing. The trail became more rugged. Loose rocks rolled under my boots, and in some places I had to grab tree trunks to pull myself up. My gloves became damp from the moss and lichen clinging to the bark. The mist grew thicker, curling around the base of the trees. My map was practically useless now. It didn't show the smaller twists and turns I was following. It was mid-afternoon when I reached the ridge. From here, the land dropped steeply away on one side, revealing a view of the valley below. The clouds hung low, and the light had a flat, gray quality that made everything look distant and cold. The trail continued along the ridge for a while before dipping back into the forest. I took a short break here, eating a protein bar and sipping water. My legs were tired, but I felt I had made good progress. I estimated I was about halfway. The descent was harder than I expected. The soil was loose, and every step threatened to send me sliding. Fallen branches lay across the path, some still slick from rain. At one point, I had to step over a section where the ground had washed away, leaving only a narrow strip of dirt between me and a steep drop. It was during this descent that I realized my GPS signal was gone. My phone showed nothing but a blank screen where the map should be. I wasn't too worried. This was expected in deep forest, but it reinforced the importance of keeping track of my direction manually. I took out my compass and checked my heading, making sure I was still going toward the exit point I had planned. Then I found the second sign something wasn't right. A torn piece of blue fabric caught on a low branch. It looked like it had come from a jacket or backpack strap. It was frayed at the edges, and there was a faint smear of dirt on it. I stood there longer than I should have, looking at it, wondering who had left it and how recently. By now, the light was fading faster than I expected. The clouds made it seem later than it was. I decided to pick up the pace, focusing on reaching the lower section of the trail before dark. That was when I heard it, the faint, rhythmic sound of something moving through the forest behind me. Not wind, not branches falling, but something deliberate. I had been planning the hike for months. The ridge trail was something I'd read about in an old guidebook I found in a secondhand store. It wasn't a popular route like the ones closer to the highway. This one was tucked away in a more remote part of the state. The trail ran for almost 20 miles along a mountain ridge before dropping down into a valley where an abandoned fire lookout sat on a rocky bluff. The book described it as a place with beautiful views, quiet isolation, and rough terrain. That isolation was exactly what drew me to it. I had been feeling restless in the city, weighed down by routine, and wanted something that would push me, both physically and mentally. It was late September when I decided to go. The weather was cooling down, the bugs had mostly gone, and the trees in the mountains were beginning to turn. I left home before dawn and drove several hours on winding roads, the pavement eventually giving way to gravel. The final stretch was a single-lane dirt road full of potholes, climbing slowly until it dead-ended in a small pull-off. There were no other cars there. The air felt sharper when I stepped out. It was cool enough that I could see my breath in faint wisps. I pulled my pack from the passenger seat, shouldered it, and double-checked the straps. I had food for 2 days, water, a filter, a small tent, and a sleeping bag. My boots felt stiff from sitting and used for too long, but I knew they would loosen up after a few miles. The trailhead was marked by a weathered wooden post with an old metal sign bolted to it. The letters were faded but still legible: Ridge Trail, 19.6 miles. The dirt underfoot was packed hard at the start, but I could already see where grasses and weeds were creeping in along the edges. It didn't look like many people had been here recently. The first few miles were steady climbing. The forest closed in quickly, tall pines rising on either side, their trunks dark with old moisture. The only sounds were my breathing and the soft crunch of my boots. As the sun came up higher, light speared through gaps in the branches, making bright patches on the ground. Every so often, a breeze would shake loose a flurry of needles, and they'd drift down in slow spirals. By mid-morning, I was sweating steadily and took a break on a flat boulder just off the path. From there, I could see through a gap in the trees to the valley far below. It was a wide stretch of land covered in patchy forest and pale brown grass, with a ribbon of river running through it. Beyond that, another range of hills rose in hazy blue layers. I drank half a bottle of water, ate a granola bar, and pressed on. The trail began to narrow after that. In places, it was barely more than a foot-wide strip of dirt with steep drops on one side. I kept my eyes on the ground, careful with my footing. A misstep here wouldn't mean an instant fall to the bottom, but it would be enough to cause injury, and I was far from help. Around noon, I reached a section where the forest thinned and the ridge became more exposed. The wind was stronger here, pulling at my jacket and making the trees creak. I could see a long way in both directions, the path I had come from winding back into the forest, and ahead, the ridge climbing toward a jagged peak. I knew from the map that the trail skirted just below the peak before dropping into the valley. I stopped for lunch on a patch of rock warmed by the sun. My legs were starting to feel the miles, but I was still making good time. While I ate, I noticed a scatter of small bones near the edge of the trail. They were clean and white, probably from a small animal like a rabbit or squirrel. There were no obvious signs of how it had died, but something about the way they were arranged in a loose arc stuck in my mind. I pushed the thought away, packed up, and continued. The afternoon miles were harder. The trail rose and fell in short, steep climbs, and in some places I had to scramble over loose rock. My pack seemed heavier with each step. Sweat cooled on my skin whenever the wind blew, and I was careful to keep moving so I wouldn't start to chill. It was late in the day when I reached a small clearing just below the peak. It was the flattest ground I had seen in hours, so I decided to set up camp there. I pitched my tent facing away from the drop-off, cooked a simple dinner on my stove, and ate while watching the sky change color. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature had dropped sharply. I pulled on an extra layer and crawled into my sleeping bag. The night was still at first. I could hear faint rustles in the undergrowth from small animals, the occasional creak of trees shifting in the wind. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to a sound that didn't fit. A dull, heavy thud, followed by the crunch of rock or dirt being displaced. I lay still, listening. It came again, closer this time, like something heavy moving deliberately along the ridge. There was no moonlight, only the faintest starlight, and I couldn't see anything beyond the thin nylon wall of my tent. The sound stopped after a while, and I told myself it was probably just a deer or elk moving through. But it took me a long time to fall asleep again. The next morning, I found fresh scuffs on the trail just beyond my campsite. The dirt was disturbed in deep, uneven patches, and a few small rocks had been knocked downhill. Whatever it was had been large and heavy. I felt a flicker of unease, but told myself it was nothing worth turning back for. The trail began to descend from the ridge shortly after. The ground here was looser, and in places it gave slightly under my boots. I took my time, planting each step carefully. The air grew warmer as I lost elevation, but the wind still reached me in occasional bursts. By midday, I reached the valley floor. The forest here was thicker, the trees spaced closely together with tangled undergrowth between them. The light was dimmer, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and moss. I checked the map and saw that the fire lookout was still about 4 miles away. As I moved through the valley, I noticed more signs of disturbed ground. Patches where leaves and soil had been turned over, branches snapped at odd angles. Once, I passed a tree with deep parallel gouges in the bark, like something had raked across it. I paused, studying the marks, then kept walking with my pack shifted higher on my shoulders. The trail to the lookout climbed again, weaving through rocks and fallen logs. When I finally saw the structure, it rose above the trees on a rocky outcrop, its wooden frame weathered and dark. The stairs leading up were missing a few planks, and the railing leaned outward in places. I climbed carefully, testing each step before putting my weight on it. At the top, the small room was mostly empty, the windows clouded with dirt and age. But the view was incredible. The valley spread out below, the ridge I had followed cutting across the horizon. I stayed just long enough to eat and rest my legs before deciding to head back down the ridge and find a place to camp for the night. I didn't want to linger there. Something about the silence felt heavy, like the air itself was watching. That night, I camped in a small clearing halfway up the ridge. I built a small fire and kept it going until I was too tired to stay awake. The darkness pressed in quickly, the stars hidden by thin clouds. I woke again to sounds in the night. This time, they were closer, moving with a steady rhythm that didn't match the lighter steps of deer. My heartbeat picked up. I stayed still, my ears straining to pick out details. There was the faint crunch of dirt, the snap of a twig, then a long pause, as if whatever it was had stopped. I thought of the gouges on the tree, the scuffed patches of earth. My mouth felt dry. The footsteps started again, moving away this time, fading into the distance. I lay awake until the first light began to seep into the tent. When I packed up, I noticed that the ground near the edge of my campsite was disturbed again. Deeper this time, as though something heavy had stood there for a while. The dirt was churned up in a wide area, and small stones had been displaced. The hike back along the ridge felt different now. I kept glancing behind me, scanning the trail ahead for movement. The forest seemed quieter, the wind less constant. My pace quickened without me meaning to. By late afternoon, I reached the trailhead. My car sat exactly where I had left it, the air around it still and untouched. I loaded my pack into the back seat and climbed in, sitting for a long moment before starting the engine. As I drove back down the dirt road, I kept thinking about the sounds, the disturbed ground, the marks on the trees. I would never know for certain what had followed me along that ridge, but I knew it was something big, something that watched and moved when it chose to. I never went back. I had done a lot of solo hikes before. Nothing crazy, just the kind where you drive out early in the morning, park somewhere quiet, walk until you've had enough, then come back in time to eat dinner at home. I liked being alone on the trail. It gave me a chance to clear my head. That's why when I saw the name of a ridge trail I hadn't tried before, just a couple of hours drive away, I didn't think much about it. The description online said it was moderately challenging and well-marked. The pictures showed open rock ledges and views that stretched for miles. Seemed like an easy win for the day. I left the house a little after sunrise with a small backpack, about 3 liters of water, a couple of protein bars, my phone, a paper map I had printed, and my folding knife. I wore my usual light hiking boots, cargo pants, and a windbreaker. The air was still cool when I reached the parking area. A dirt lot with room for maybe 8 cars. Mine was the only one there. That should have made me pause. Most trails, even the lesser-known ones, had at least a few other hikers in the morning. But instead, I saw it as a bonus. The ridge would be all mine. The first part of the trail was easy. Packed dirt, a gradual incline, trees spaced out so the sunlight came through in thin beams. The air smelled like pine and damp leaves. I could hear birds calling from somewhere above, and every now and then, the rustle of something small in the underbrush. I walked steadily, my boots crunching over the soil and loose twigs, and after about 20 minutes, I reached a split in the trail. The left fork was marked with a weathered wooden sign pointing toward the ridge loop. The right fork had no sign at all. My printed map showed the left as the official path, so I went that way, telling myself I might check out the other later if I had time. The climb was gentle at first, then steeper as the trail wound between boulders. There were occasional painted blazes on trees, faded orange rectangles that reassured me I was still on track. As I climbed, the air grew warmer and the breeze picked up. I could feel sweat starting under my jacket. I unzipped it and kept going. By the time I reached the first overlook, I could see the valley spread out below. The river was a thin silver line, and beyond it, a quilt of farmland and forest. It was the kind of view that made you stop without realizing it, just to take in the scale. I stood there for a few minutes, drinking from my water bottle, before pushing on. The trail narrowed after that, the dirt giving way to rougher ground, roots, loose rocks, and patches where rain had washed channels into the slope. I had to watch my footing carefully. In some spots, the ridge dropped sharply on one side, a long tumble down to treetops far below. I was careful not to get too close to the edge. About 2 hours in, I reached a point where the trail seemed less obvious. The blazes were farther apart, and some looked like they'd been scratched over by weather. I followed what looked like a path, flattened earth, broken twigs, but after a while, I realized I hadn't seen a blaze in several minutes. The slope to my right was too steep to easily climb down, so I kept going, thinking the trail would reappear. Instead, the ground became rockier, the trees more tangled. There were game trails crisscrossing the slope, thin lines of trampled plants, but no clear hiking route. I stopped, pulled out my map, and tried to match the contours to where I thought I was. It didn't help much. On paper, the ridge was just a long, narrow strip, with the trail looping back on itself. But here, in the middle of it, everything looked the same: gray stone, brown trunks, green leaves. I decided to backtrack until I found a blaze. That was easier said than done. The ground behind me didn't look exactly like it had when I came through, and without a definite path, I found myself weaving around rocks and down branches, trying to remember landmarks I'd barely noticed before. After 10 minutes, I stopped again. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, not from exertion, but from the creeping realization that I wasn't exactly sure where I was anymore. I told myself to stay calm. I still had food, water, and daylight. I took out my phone. No service. I wasn't surprised, it was a remote ridge, but the empty bars on the screen still made my stomach sink a little. I decided to aim downhill. In theory, that should eventually bring me to the base of the ridge, where I could follow the contour back toward the parking lot. I started descending, moving slowly so I wouldn't slip on loose stones. The slope was steeper than it had looked from above, and in places I had to lower myself down ledges using both hands. My palms got scraped more than once. The trees were thicker here, and the ground littered with fallen logs. I could hear the occasional rustle of something moving away through the undergrowth, probably deer, but it made me glance over my shoulder all the same. I kept expecting to hear the sound of the trail again, the steady crunch of a well-worn path, but all I got was the uneven noise of my own boots in the leaves. After another half hour, the slope eased, and I found myself in a narrow gully. The air was cooler here, damp. A thin stream ran through the bottom, trickling over stones. I knelt to refill one of my water bottles using my filter pump. The water was icy and tasted faintly of minerals. I drank half a bottle before standing again. I followed the stream, thinking it might lead me to a larger waterway, which in turn might take me toward a road or the valley. But the gully wound back and forth endlessly, and the light filtering through the trees was dimmer now. My watch said it was only early afternoon, but in this hollow it felt later. I came to a fallen tree blocking the stream and had to climb over it. As I did, my foot slipped on the mossy bark, and I went down hard on my side. My hip thudded against a stone, and pain shot up my back. I lay there for a moment, breathing through clenched teeth, before forcing myself upright. Nothing felt broken, but I knew the bruise would be bad. I pressed on. My pace was slower now, both from the ache in my side and the growing fatigue in my legs. I kept thinking I heard faint movement somewhere behind me. A snap of a twig, a swish through the leaves, but every time I turned, there was nothing, just the empty trees. When the gully finally widened into a flatter area, I thought I'd feel relief. Instead, the ground here was marshy, and the air smelled stagnant. The mud sucked at my boots, pulling at them with each step. I skirted around the worst spots, but my socks were soon damp from the wet ground. I could feel the chill creeping up from my feet. I knew then I wasn't going to make it out before dark. That thought shifted everything. I wasn't just hiking anymore. I was surviving until morning. I started scanning for a place to shelter. Eventually, I found a rock overhang about 4 feet high, with a shallow dry space beneath. It wasn't much, but it was better than sleeping exposed. I cleared out some debris, sat down, and pulled my jacket tight around me. I ate one of my protein bars slowly, forcing myself to chew even though I wasn't hungry. The forest changed as the light faded. The birds went quiet. In their place came other sounds, small rustles, the occasional sharp crack of something stepping on a branch far off. I stayed still, my back against the rock, eyes fixed on the darkness in front of me. I don't know how long I sat like that before exhaustion pulled me under. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving nearby. Not the quick, light steps of a squirrel, but slower, heavier. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps paused, then resumed, passing somewhere just beyond my view. I didn't move until the sound faded entirely. Morning came cold and gray. My hip was stiff, my leg sore. I forced myself up, drank a little water, and started moving again. I decided to keep the rising sun on my left. That should bring me roughly toward the parking area, based on where I thought I'd ended up. The hours blurred into a steady grind of walking, stumbling, correcting my course when the terrain forced me offline. Around midday, I finally saw something that made my chest tighten. A narrow strip of packed dirt winding between trees. The trail. I stepped onto it and almost laughed from relief. I followed it without hesitation, and within an hour, I was back at the parking lot. My car sat there, the only one, exactly as I'd left it. The ridge above looked quiet, almost peaceful, as if it hadn't held me in its grip for more than a day. When I shut the car door, I realized my hands were shaking, not from cold or hunger, but from the understanding of how close I'd come to being just another name in the news, a hiker who went out alone and didn't come back. I didn't tell anyone the full story afterward. People would have said I was careless, and they'd be right. But what I remember most isn't the mistake of losing the trail. It's the silence of the ridge when I knew I was alone, and the feeling that something out there was moving just far enough behind me to stay unseen. I had planned the hike weeks in advance. It wasn't supposed to be anything dangerous, just a long, challenging day trip to a ridge that offered wide views over a valley I had never seen before. I'd found it on a small hiking blog, tucked between entries about easier local trails. The post was old, maybe 10 years, but the pictures were still clear. There was something about the emptiness of the place that made me want to go. I left early that morning, long before sunrise. My car was packed with water, food, extra layers, and a small emergency kit. I wanted to be on the trail by first light. The air was cool when I stepped out at the small dirt pull-off that passed for a parking area. There were no other cars. I liked that, quiet, no one else around. But at the same time, the absence of any other hikers made the place feel forgotten. The trail began at the edge of a patchy forest. The first 100 yards were choked with overgrowth, as if no one had cleared it in years. I stepped over deadfall and ducked under branches. The ground was damp from recent rain, and my boots left deep prints in the dark mud. As I climbed, the sun started pushing light through the treetops. Mist clung to the lower branches, and my breath came out in faint clouds. The path was steeper than I expected. It wound sharply upward, following the natural contours of the slope. There was no sound except the dull thud of my boots and the occasional distant crack of a branch under its own weight. The deeper I went, the more the forest changed. The air felt heavier, wetter. The ground underfoot turned from soil to slick rock, and moss coated almost every surface. After an hour, the trail opened briefly onto a rocky clearing. From there, I could see the valley far below. The land rolled out in folds of green and brown, and the river cut a pale ribbon through the center. But my view was limited. The ridge was still above me, hidden by another steep wall of forest. I took a drink from my water bottle and pressed on. The climb grew rougher. The old trail markers, faded paint blazes on tree trunks, were harder to spot. Sometimes I'd lose sight of them entirely and have to double back. The trail switchbacks were narrow and, in places, partly eroded away. One wrong step on the outer edge could send a person sliding a long way down. After maybe 3 hours of steady climbing, I noticed something strange. The switchbacks that had been so clear earlier suddenly seemed to vanish. Instead of a tight zigzag, the trail ahead curved and then split. There were no markers. I stopped, catching my breath, and scanned the trees. No paint, no cairns, no signs of human maintenance. I chose the path that seemed most worn and kept going. It was a mistake. Within 20 minutes, the path narrowed until it was barely more than a strip of dirt. It skirted the side of a steep slope with loose rocks underfoot. My calves burned from trying to keep balance. I thought about turning back but kept telling myself the trail might rejoin the main route ahead. Then the dirt strip simply ended at a tumble of rock and dead trees. I cursed under my breath and turned around. Backtracking was harder than I expected. The ground sloped awkwardly, and the loose rocks shifted under my weight. At one point, my boots slipped on wet moss, and I went down hard on one knee. The jolt shot up my leg, and pain flared deep in the joint. I sat for a minute, clutching my knee, testing if I could still put weight on it. It hurt, but it held. I got up slowly, limping a little, and made my way back the way I'd come. When I reached the split again, I tried the other direction. This path felt more like a real trail, but it led me deeper into a part of the forest where the light barely reached the ground. The air smelled thick, like rotting leaves and damp earth. The silence was heavier here. No wind in the branches, no bird calls. I stopped once, just to listen. My own breathing seemed loud. The ground was uneven, rising and falling over small ridges. I had to focus on my footing, stepping from root to rock and back again. I noticed faint impressions in the dirt. Maybe animal tracks, maybe old boot prints, but they were too smudged to read clearly. At one point, I crossed a shallow creek. The water was cold and clear, but the rocks beneath were slick. I nearly lost my footing again, catching myself on a low branch. My knee throbbed worse after that. I considered stopping to rest, but I wanted to get out of the denser part of the forest first. The trail began climbing again, and I thought I might be back on the right route to the ridge. But then I noticed something else. The light was shifting in a way that told me I'd lost more time than I thought. The sun was past its highest point, the shadows lengthening. I checked my watch. It was later than I expected. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I wasn't scared exactly, just aware that I had wandered off the main trail and might not have as much daylight as I thought. The ridge still wasn't in sight. The climb steepened again, forcing me to use my hands in places. Loose dirt crumbled away under my fingers, and more than once I had to stop and test each step before putting weight on it. My water bottle was half empty. I rationed sips, feeling the dryness building in my throat. When the ground finally leveled, I found myself on another clearing, but not the ridge I was aiming for. This was smaller, enclosed on 3 sides by trees. The 4th side dropped away into a sheer slope. I walked to the edge and looked down. The valley below was still far away, and I couldn't see the river anymore. I realized I had gone completely off the mapped route. The first real stab of fear hit then. I tried to retrace my steps, but the entrance to the clearing looked different now. I turned one way, then another, trying to spot where I had come in. The trees seemed to press closer. My breathing picked up, and my knee was starting to stiffen from the earlier fall. I forced myself to pick a direction and walk. The trail, if it could even be called that, twisted unpredictably. Every time I thought I recognized a landmark, it turned out to be something else. The terrain was starting to look the same in every direction. Slopes, fallen logs, patches of ferns. When I finally stopped, I realized the forest had gone even quieter than before. The silence wasn't just absence of sound. It felt like the place itself was holding its breath. My skin prickled. I scanned the trees and thought I saw movement far off, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. I checked my watch again. Time was sliding faster now, the daylight thinning. I knew I had to find the creek again. Water would be my best guide back toward lower ground. I pushed through a tangle of brush, snapping small branches with my legs, and kept moving downhill. By the time I heard water, the light was dim and uneven. The creek looked different from before, wider with darker banks. My boots sank into the mud as I followed it downstream. But the banks grew steeper, forcing me to climb higher along the side. My knee screamed with each push. Eventually, I found a narrow section I could cross. My boots slipped on the wet stone and I nearly fell again, but I made it to the other side. There was still no sign of the main trail. By now, the forest was dim enough that colors were flattening into grays. I knew I wouldn't make it back before nightfall. The idea of being stuck here overnight tightened in my chest. I scanned for a place to shelter, somewhere flat, dry, and defensible. I found a shallow depression under a rock outcrop. It wasn't perfect, but it would keep some of the wind off. I cleared away debris and sat down, pulling my pack close. I ate sparingly from my food, listening to the creeping dark. The night was long. Every rustle made me tense. Sometimes it was just wind through leaves. Sometimes it sounded heavier, like footsteps on damp soil. I gripped my small flashlight, using it only in short bursts to conserve batteries. The beam caught glints in the undergrowth, eyes reflecting back, but they vanished quickly. When the first light of morning bled into the trees, I got moving again. My body ached, my knee barely bending. I followed the creek until it met a wider stream, then kept going. Hours later, the sound of a car engine reached me faintly. I pushed through the last wall of trees and stumbled onto a gravel service road. I had no idea where on the mountain I was, but at least I was out of the forest. I limped along until I saw a ranger truck parked by a gate. By the time I reached my car again later that afternoon, the sun was low. My legs were shaking, my throat dry. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine. I didn't make it to the ridge that day, and now, I'm not sure I'd ever want to. The switchback I missed is still out there somewhere, but so is that feeling, the moment when you realize the trail isn't leading you back, and you don't know if it ever will. I had been planning the hike for almost 2 weeks. The trail wasn't famous or even particularly scenic compared to the popular routes in the area, but it was quiet, and that's what I wanted. It wound through a long stretch of hills and pine forest before climbing up a ridge where the view was supposed to be wide open. I had read online that it could be tricky in places, narrow switchbacks, loose rock, and some steep drop-offs, but nothing that seemed beyond my ability. I packed the night before. I made sure I had everything I would need: water, extra layers, snacks, first aid kit, flashlight, whistle, and a power bank for my phone. My boots were already broken in. I even checked the weather 3 times. It was supposed to be clear and cool with no rain. I thought I had covered every base. I started early in the morning, just after sunrise. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. The parking lot at the trailhead was empty, which was exactly how I wanted it. The first mile or so was easy, flat dirt path through tall grass and scattered trees. The light was soft and golden, and there was no wind. After about half an hour, the trail narrowed, and the ground changed from dirt to a mix of rock and loose gravel. The incline began to rise slowly at first, then more steeply. I could hear the distant rush of water somewhere below, though I never actually saw a stream. The trail twisted and curved, sometimes dipping into small shaded hollows where the air felt cooler and damp. The first set of switchbacks wasn't bad. They were tight, but the drop-offs weren't sheer, and there were enough trees along the edges to make me feel secure. I paced myself, stopping now and then to drink water and catch my breath. My legs warmed up quickly, and I felt strong. The ridge was still a good distance away, but I could see it now, a dark shape rising above the treeline. I kept moving, letting the rhythm of my steps take over. For a while, it was almost peaceful. Then the trail changed again. The trees thinned out, and the ground became uneven and rocky. The switchbacks here were sharper, cut into the side of the hill with nothing but empty air on the outer edge. The drop was easily 100 feet in places. The dirt was dry and loose, and every step sent tiny pebbles skittering down into the void. I slowed down, planting each foot carefully. The higher I went, the more I noticed the wind. It wasn't strong, but it came in sudden, cold bursts, pushing against my side. I shifted my balance each time, pressing closer to the inner wall of the trail. About 3 miles in, I came to a spot where the trail had partially collapsed. A chunk of the path had broken away, leaving a gap about 2 feet across. On the inside edge, there was a slope of dirt and rock that looked stable enough to step over, but on the outside edge, the ground just dropped away. I paused there for a while, weighing it in my head. I finally crossed, leaning toward the wall of dirt as I stepped over the gap. My boots slipped slightly on loose gravel, and my heart jumped, but I caught myself. I kept moving after that, trying not to think too hard about what would have happened if I'd lost my footing. The trail wound upward in tighter and tighter loops. In some spots, the inner wall was just rock, scraped smooth by wind and weather with no real place to grab if I slipped. The outer edge fell away into steep slopes littered with jagged rock. I started thinking about how long it had been since I'd seen a safe, flat spot to rest. Around the 4th mile, I noticed the sky had changed. The bright, clear blue had gone dull and pale. Thin clouds were sliding in from the west, and the sun was starting to fade behind them. I checked my watch. It was just after noon. The hike up had taken longer than I'd planned, but I thought I still had plenty of time to reach the ridge and make it back before dark. I kept going, but I began to feel a low, restless unease in my stomach. The wind was stronger now, carrying a faint whistle through the rocks. The trail here was barely wide enough for my boots, and I could see where recent rock slides had scattered debris across it. I told myself I just needed to focus. One step, then the next. Don't look down. Don't think about falling. At one point, the trail dipped under an overhang, the rock ceiling only a few feet above my head. The floor here was slick with dust and gravel, and it tilted toward the drop-off. I moved slowly, leaning into the rock wall, using my hands for balance. My palms were coated in grit when I made it out the other side. From there, I could see the ridge clearly. It was maybe half a mile away, rising steep and bare, the trail cutting across its face in narrow zigzags. But between me and it was the worst stretch yet. A series of exposed bends where the trail had been eaten away by erosion. The drop-offs were sharper here, the wind stronger. I thought about turning back. I even took a step in that direction. But something in me didn't want to waste the climb I'd already done. I decided I'd at least try to reach the next safe spot and then decide. The first bend wasn't too bad. The second was worse. Loose gravel under my boots, the ground sloping slightly toward the edge. I crouched a little as I moved, keeping my center of gravity low. By the 3rd bend, the wind was so strong it made my jacket flap against my arms. A thin spray of pebbles rattled down the slope beside me. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. Then it happened. As I stepped onto a narrow strip of trail, my right foot slid on loose gravel. My ankle twisted hard, sending a sharp pain up my leg. I dropped into a crouch, one hand grabbing at the dirt wall beside me. A chunk of rock gave way under my fingers, tumbling into the drop. My boot was half off the edge before I yanked it back. I froze there, crouched low, breathing hard. My ankle throbbed, not broken, but definitely strained. I knew right then that I couldn't keep going up. The descent was worse than the climb. Every step down sent a fresh jolt through my ankle. I moved slowly, sometimes shuffling sideways, always keeping one hand on the rock wall. My legs were shaking, not just from the injury, but from the fear still clamped tight in my chest. It felt like hours before I reached the section where the trail widened a little. I found a flat rock to sit on and drank half my water in one go. My hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped the bottle. I still had miles to go, but the switchbacks here were at least manageable. I took them one at a time, focusing only on the few feet ahead of me. My ankle burned with each step. The wind didn't help. It blew dust into my eyes and made the loose gravel shift under me. By the time I reached the collapsed section again, I was exhausted. Crossing it with my injured ankle was slow and awkward. I ended up sitting and scooting across on my backside, ignoring the dirt grinding into my clothes. The lower part of the trail felt almost safe compared to the upper sections, but I didn't relax until I saw the first stretch of flat ground. Even then, I didn't stop moving. My ankle hurt too much to rest. It felt like if I sat down, I might not get up again. When I finally stepped into the parking lot, the sky was completely overcast. The air had a damp, heavy feel, like rain was coming. My car was the only one there. I tossed my pack into the back seat, got in, and just sat for a few minutes with my hands gripping the steering wheel. The ridge had beaten me. I hadn't reached the top, but I was alive, and that felt like more of a victory than anything else. On that trail, in that wind, with that drop yawning at my side, I'd felt how easy it would be to vanish, how quickly a single misstep could erase me from the world. I drove home slowly, my ankle throbbing, my hands still tight on the wheel. The image of that narrow strip of trail, the empty air beyond it, stayed in my mind for days. Even now, I can see it whenever I close my eyes, the place where one bad step almost ended everything. I decided to take the trip alone. It had been years since I'd gone anywhere without someone tagging along, and I thought the quiet would be good for me. I had a few days off from work. The weather was supposed to be clear, and I found a trail online that looked challenging but doable. The hike would take me through a remote section of forest, winding through ridges and valleys before looping back toward the parking area. It was about 16 miles total, but the plan was to camp somewhere halfway just off the trail. I packed my bag the night before. I went over everything twice: sleeping bag, tent, food, stove, extra layers, first aid kit, water filter, flashlight, map, and compass. I didn't expect cell service out there. My boots were broken in, my socks were thick, and I made sure the pack was balanced so it wouldn't strain my back. The weather report said highs in the low 70s, lows in the mid-40s, with a chance of wind later in the week. Nothing alarming. I left before sunrise. The drive to the trailhead took a little over 2 hours. The last stretch of road was narrow and winding, with tall pines closing in from both sides. My car was the only one in the dirt lot when I pulled in. It was quiet enough that I could hear the creak of my own car as it settled after I shut the engine off. The air smelled cold and damp, like moss and wet leaves. I signed my name in the trail register, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started up the trail. The first couple miles were easy, well-worn dirt path, gradual incline, tall trees with patches of blue sky peeking through. I could hear birds calling high above and the occasional rustle of something small in the undergrowth. I tried to keep my pace steady. It felt good to be moving, my body warming up against the chill. By late morning, the trail narrowed and the terrain grew rougher. The ground was uneven, scattered with roots and rocks. Fallen branches forced me to step carefully in places. The trees grew closer together, and the sunlight thinned to a pale, filtered glow. I stopped once to drink water and check my map. According to the marker on the map, I was making good time, a little ahead of schedule. I decided I could push deeper before looking for a campsite. As the day went on, I noticed fewer signs of people. The trail here wasn't as clear. Some sections looked like they hadn't been walked in weeks. Fallen leaves covered the path, and I had to check for blazes on the trees to make sure I was still going the right way. Around 3 in the afternoon, I crossed a small creek. The water was cold and fast-moving, about ankle deep. I stepped across carefully on a few exposed rocks. On the far side, the air felt different, stiller, heavier. The forest was quiet here, with fewer birds. The sun was lowering by the time I found a spot to camp. It was a small clearing just off the trail, surrounded by thick trees. The ground was flat enough for my tent, and there was a rotting log nearby I could use as a seat. I set up camp methodically, tent first, then sleeping bag and pad, then my small stove for dinner. The air cooled quickly once the sun dipped below the ridge. I boiled water for a simple meal, ate slowly, and cleaned up right away so I wouldn't attract animals. When the light faded completely, I sat for a while with my headlamp off, letting my eyes adjust. The darkness was heavy, almost tangible. I could hear the occasional creak of branches, the distant sound of wind moving through the higher canopy, and once or twice a faint rustle of leaves from somewhere beyond the circle of my camp. It wasn't unusual. Forests are full of small noises at night. Still, I crawled into my tent earlier than planned. The night was long. The wind picked up around midnight, rattling the tent fabric. Once, I woke to what sounded like footsteps moving slowly through the leaves nearby. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. The sound came in short bursts, then stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. I was up at first light. The air inside the tent was cold enough to make me see my breath. I ate a quick breakfast, packed up, and got back on the trail. My plan was to complete the loop and get back to my car before dark. The trail from here grew steeper and more rugged. I had to climb over boulders in places, and some sections were so narrow they barely fit my boots. The trees thinned as I gained elevation, opening up occasional views of the surrounding ridges. It was beautiful but also unnerving. The distance between me and any sign of people felt immense. Sometime before noon, I reached a section of trail that looked different from my map. The blaze marks were faded, and the path split in two directions. I checked my compass and guessed the left fork was the correct one. I followed it for about half a mile before realizing something was wrong. The trail grew faint and eventually disappeared altogether, swallowed by undergrowth. I stopped and backtracked, but the fork was harder to find than I expected. I started to feel the first prickles of unease. My map didn't show this section clearly, and without a defined trail, it was easy to lose bearings. I tried to stay calm and focused. I used my compass, retraced steps, scanned for blazes, but after another half hour, I was still wandering through unfamiliar terrain. The forest here felt different. The trees were older, their trunks wide and covered in thick moss. The ground was uneven, with sudden dips and ridges. Every direction looked the same. I could hear my own breathing louder than anything else. I knew the worst thing I could do was panic. I stopped to drink water, eat a snack, and think. My plan was to head downhill. Eventually, I'd reach a creek or road. But the terrain didn't cooperate. Steep gullies forced me to detour, and dense thickets slowed my pace. My legs were starting to ache. By late afternoon, I still hadn't found the trail. The light was fading, and I had to face the fact I'd be spending another night out here. I looked for a safe spot to camp, somewhere sheltered, with no risk of loose branches overhead. I found a flat area beneath a cluster of pines and set up quickly. I ate sparingly, conserving food. That night was worse. The wind had died down, leaving the forest silent. Too silent. Every small sound seemed magnified. The crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves. At one point, I heard something move slowly past my camp. The steps were heavier than a deer's, more deliberate. They stopped, then started again, circling at a distance. I stayed still in my sleeping bag, heart pounding. The sound eventually faded, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I decided to keep heading downhill, hoping to intersect the main loop or a creek. My water was running low, so I needed a source soon. Around mid-morning, I heard the faint sound of running water and followed it. The creek was small but clear. I knelt to refill my bottles and used my filter to make it safe to drink. Following the creek seemed like the best option, but it wound through rough terrain. I slipped several times on wet rocks and had to push through dense undergrowth. My arms and legs were scratched raw. At one point, I thought I heard movement behind me, a faint crunch of leaves, but when I turned, the forest was still. By early afternoon, I came to a spot where the creek dropped into a narrow ravine. I had to climb carefully down, gripping roots and rocks. At the bottom, the air was damp and cold, and the walls of the ravine blocked most of the light. I kept moving, trying not to think about how far I was from help. Then I saw it, a faint outline of a trail cutting across the creek ahead. Relief hit me so hard I almost laughed. I scrambled toward it and recognized the faded blaze marks on a tree. I didn't know exactly where I was, but I was back on a marked path. I followed it without stopping, my legs burning. The sun was low when I finally saw the dirt parking lot through the trees. My car was still there, exactly where I'd left it. The sight of it felt unreal. I dropped my pack in the back seat, sat in the driver's seat, and just breathed for a while before starting the engine. It wasn't until I was halfway down the mountain road that the tension really left me. My muscles ached, my hands were scratched and blistered, and my clothes smelled of sweat and wood smoke. But I was out. I knew I'd been lucky. Lucky I'd found water. Lucky I'd found the trail again. Lucky nothing worse had happened in those woods. I thought about the sounds I'd heard at night, the slow, deliberate steps moving past my camp. I'd never know what it was. Maybe an animal, maybe not. But I knew one thing. The forest had been watching me in its own way the entire time. I decided to hike alone that day. It wasn't a last-minute thing. I had been planning it for over a month. The trail was one I had read about in a local guide, a long ridge route that followed a winding line above a deep valley. It wasn't a popular tourist spot, which was one of the reasons I wanted to go there. I liked quiet trails where I could hear my own footsteps and the wind instead of constant chatter. The guide mentioned that it was about 12 miles end-to-end if you followed it all the way, but it was an out-and-back route. That meant 24 miles total if I wanted to get back to my car without taking any shortcuts. I thought I was ready for it. I had done long hikes before, and I had always been careful with food, water, and supplies. I packed my small backpack with 2.5 liters of water, a couple of protein bars, some trail mix, a rain jacket, a headlamp, and a first aid kit. My boots were well worn but solid. The day started clear and cool, the kind of weather that makes you believe you could walk forever without tiring. The air was damp from the previous night's rain, and the ground was soft, smelling of wet earth and pine needles. Birds moved through the treetops, unseen but loud. The trail began with a steady uphill climb, weaving between tall pines and boulders, the ridge still hidden somewhere above me. After about 40 minutes, I reached the first viewpoint. The forest dropped away to my left, and I could see the valley below, a winding ribbon of a river, glittering in the sunlight, with clusters of dark green trees crowding the banks. On the opposite side of the valley, steep hills rose like waves frozen in place. There was no sign of houses or roads, just raw, open land. It was the kind of view that made me feel both lucky and slightly uneasy. That much space, that much quiet, made me aware of how small I really was. I kept moving. The trail narrowed in places, the ridge falling sharply on one side. Some parts had crumbled away, forcing me to step carefully on loose rock. My breathing was steady, my legs strong, and I was enjoying the rhythm of walking. The crunch of gravel under my boots, the swish of my backpack straps, the distant sound of the wind passing through the trees. About 3 miles in, the ridge leveled out. The forest thinned, replaced by patches of low shrubs and bare rock. I saw signs of deer, tracks pressed into the soft soil, the occasional droppings, but no animals. The sun was higher now, and I felt its heat on the back of my neck. I took my first drink of water and checked the time. Everything was on schedule. By mile 5, the trail felt more remote. The air seemed stiller here, the sound of the valley river too far away to hear anymore. I started noticing details that made me uneasy without knowing exactly why. The trees were twisted by wind, their branches bent into odd shapes. The ground was dry despite the rain from the night before. The dirt cracked in places. There were no birds singing now, just silence, broken only by my footsteps. It was around this point I saw the first sign of trouble. A narrow section of the trail hugged the side of the ridge, with a steep drop to the right. I slowed my pace, watching my footing. About halfway across, I saw a section of dirt slide slightly under my weight. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me stop. I crouched and tested the ground with my boot. Loose gravel rolled away and tumbled down into the valley, bouncing and disappearing into the trees far below. I moved slower after that, planting each step carefully until I reached more solid ground. The trail climbed again after that, leading to a high point on the ridge. From up there, I could see the next several miles of the route stretching out ahead. It was a thin brown line cutting across rocky outcrops, disappearing into thicker forest in the distance. I felt a little tired but good. I figured I would push to the halfway point, rest, and then turn back. I didn't know then that turning back would not be as simple as I imagined. The first real problem came at mile 7. The trail dipped into a shaded hollow where the air felt cooler and damp. The ground here was covered in a thin layer of moss, soft under my boots. But in the middle of that green carpet was a section of mud, deep, wet, and black. I could see where other hikers had gone around it, leaving faint side tracks through the brush. I followed one of those detours, ducking under branches, only to find the ground just as bad on the other side. I tested the mud with my trekking pole, and it sank in more than a foot with almost no resistance. There was no clear, dry way across. I decided to move slowly, stepping on the thickest patches of moss, shifting my weight carefully so I wouldn't sink too deep. Even so, my left boot slid once, and for a second my foot went in almost to the ankle. The mud sucked at it like glue. I yanked it free with a wet, sucking noise, my heart thudding faster than it should have. Once I made it through, I kept walking, but my pace had slowed. My boots were heavier now from the wet mud, and I could feel a faint dampness seeping into my left sock. At mile 8, I stopped to eat a protein bar and drink more water. I still felt confident about reaching the halfway point, but the air had changed again. The sky was no longer the clear blue from earlier. A haze had settled over the ridge, softening the edges of the hills in the distance. It wasn't quite fog, but it had that same dulling effect. I checked my watch. It was early afternoon, but it looked later. The halfway point, mile 12, should have been just another 4 miles ahead. I started again, moving at a steady pace, but the trail seemed to stretch longer than it should have. Every time I crested a rise, expecting to see the halfway marker mentioned in the guide, I saw only more trail bending away into the distance. I told myself I must have misjudged the distance. Maybe I had slowed down more than I thought. But then I started noticing something that made me uneasy. Faint prints in the dirt that didn't look like deer. They were boot prints, but the tread was strange, almost worn flat. And they weren't recent. The edges were soft, partly filled with dust and small debris. At mile 10, I found the first one that made me stop. It was a boot print, but next to it was something else. A single scuff mark, as if someone had dragged a foot. Then another a few feet ahead. A boot print, then a drag. Boot print, drag. I followed them for maybe 100 yards before they vanished where the ground turned rocky. The wind picked up then, carrying a faint, dry smell like old leaves. I adjusted my backpack straps and kept moving, but I no longer felt entirely alone. That was when the ridge began to feel different. Not dangerous yet, but indifferent, like it wouldn't care if I made it out or not. The silence pressed in harder. My breathing sounded louder, sharper. By the time I realized I should turn back, I had gone too far. I had been planning the trip for months. It wasn't supposed to be anything extreme, just a 3-day solo hike through a part of the mountain range that I had always wanted to explore. The place wasn't especially famous. There were no tourist signs, no big crowds, and no perfectly maintained trails. That was part of the attraction. It was remote, quiet, and felt untouched. I left home before sunrise on a cool Thursday morning. The sky was a pale gray blue, the kind of light that makes everything look calm. I had my pack ready the night before. Tent, sleeping bag, 3 days worth of food, water filter, a small stove, extra clothes, map, compass, and my first aid kit. I always packed more than I thought I'd need, because in the back of my mind I knew that things could go wrong. The plan was simple. I'd start from the trailhead on the southern side of the ridge, follow the old forestry track for the first few miles, then cut across into a narrower trail that went higher up into the mountains. From there, I'd set up camp somewhere near the top. Then on the second day, hike along the ridge until I reached a small lake on the far side. The third day, I'd loop back down to where I started. When I arrived at the trailhead, there was no one else there. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. The forest was still, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I signed the trail register in the small metal box, just my name, date, and intended route, then pulled on my pack and started walking. The first couple of hours were easy. The forestry road was wide and slightly uphill, with soft gravel under my boots. Sunlight started to break through the trees, lighting up the wet leaves and branches. I passed 2 abandoned logging machines, half covered in moss and surrounded by ferns. They looked like they had been sitting there for decades. Eventually, I reached the turnoff where the smaller trail began. This was where the hike started to feel more wild. The ground was uneven, with roots snaking across the path and rocks hidden under the fallen leaves. I climbed steeply in places, and I found myself breathing harder. The trees grew closer together, blocking out much of the sunlight, and the air felt cooler. By noon, I reached a point where the trail leveled out and opened onto a narrow ridge. On my left side, the ground dropped sharply into a forested valley. On my right, it sloped down into another valley, but this one was more open, with rocky outcrops and patches of bare earth. The wind was stronger here, carrying the faint smell of pine sap and damp soil. I stopped for lunch, just a couple of energy bars and water, and checked my map. My intended campsite for the night was still a few miles ahead, on a flat section just before the ridge rose again. I tightened the straps on my pack and kept going. The ridge trail was rougher than I expected. In some places, the path narrowed to only a couple of feet wide, with steep drop-offs on either side. The ground was dry and loose in spots, and I had to be careful not to slip. I kept my eyes on the ground most of the time, placing each step carefully. After about an hour, I came to a section where the trail dipped slightly and curved around a rocky ledge. The drop on the left was sheer, at least 50 feet straight down to a slope of jagged rocks. I slowed down, pressing myself slightly toward the right-hand wall of rock as I edged along. My boots scraped against the loose gravel, sending a few small stones tumbling into the void below. When I got past that section, the trail widened again, but I realized I was more tense than I thought. My hands were slightly sweaty inside my gloves, and I felt my shoulders tight from holding myself rigid. The sky had been clear earlier, but now thin clouds were moving in, dimming the light. The wind picked up, making the trees in the valleys sway and creak. I kept checking my watch and estimating how much daylight I had left. I didn't want to set up camp in the dark. By the time I reached the flat area I had planned to camp at, the sun was already low in the sky. The spot was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by trees, with just enough space for my tent and a good view of the ridge ahead. I dropped my pack, stretched my sore shoulders, and started unpacking. I set up my tent quickly, then boiled water for a dehydrated meal. The wind had died down, and everything was quiet except for the occasional distant bird call. I sat on a fallen log, eating slowly, watching the sky turn pink, then orange, then deep purple. When it got dark, I climbed into my sleeping bag and lay there listening. The forest has a way of magnifying small sounds at night. A twig snapping somewhere nearby, leaves rustling as something small moves through them. I tried not to think about what could be out there. The night passed without incident, and I woke up to a pale gray dawn. My breath fogged the air inside the tent. I packed up quickly, wanting to get moving while the air was still cool. The second day was supposed to be the hardest, following the ridge trail most of the way to the lake. The path grew more difficult as I climbed higher. There were stretches where I had to scramble over rocks, using my hands to pull myself up. In other places, the trail became so narrow that my boots barely fit side by side. Around midday, I reached the highest point so far. From there, I could see the ridge stretching ahead like a jagged spine. The drop-offs on both sides were even steeper here, and the wind was strong enough to make me lean slightly into it. I stopped to drink water and steady my breathing. It was around this point that I noticed something. About 100 yards ahead, the trail crossed a section of exposed rock with no trees, and on that rock, there was something lying there, small, dark, and oddly out of place. I kept walking, my eyes fixed on it. When I got closer, I saw it was a torn piece of fabric. It looked like it had been part of a jacket. Dark blue, frayed at the edges and dirty. The wind moved it slightly, but it was caught under a small rock. That was strange enough, but then I noticed something else. Faint scuff marks in the dirt nearby, like someone had slipped or fallen. They led toward the edge of the drop-off. I froze, staring at the marks. The edge here went straight down, hundreds of feet into a steep, rocky slope. My stomach tightened. I walked to the edge and looked down. There was nothing obvious down there, just jagged rocks and sparse vegetation. I backed away from the edge slowly, my heart beating faster. I couldn't explain why, but I suddenly felt like I shouldn't be there. I kept moving, but I was more alert now, scanning the trail ahead constantly. Every so often, I thought I saw something in the distance, a faint movement in the trees or along the ridge, but when I looked directly at it, there was nothing. The trail became more difficult again, and I had to focus on each step. My legs were starting to ache, and the wind was colder now. By late afternoon, I was still a mile from the lake, but I decided I needed to find a place to camp. The clouds were thicker, and the light was fading faster than I expected. I spotted a small flat area just off the trail, partially sheltered by boulders, and set up my tent there. That night, I lay awake for hours. I kept hearing faint noises, not the normal rustling of small animals, but heavier sounds, like footsteps on loose gravel. Every time I sat up and listened, the sound stopped. By morning, I was exhausted, but I packed up and pushed on toward the lake. My plan was to reach it, rest for a bit, then start looping back toward the trailhead. The lake was small and still, surrounded by rocks. The surface reflected the heavy gray clouds above. I dropped my pack and crouched to filter some water, but I kept glancing around. It was then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Across the lake, partly hidden among the rocks, was a backpack. It looked weathered, the fabric faded and torn, but it was clearly a hiking pack. No one else had signed the trail register when I set out. That meant it had been there for a long time, or someone had come in another way. I didn't go closer. I didn't want to. Instead, I shouldered my pack and started heading back the way I came, moving faster than I had on the way up. The ridge felt different now, more exposed, more dangerous. Every gust of wind made me tense. At one narrow section, I thought I heard something behind me. I stopped, turned, and scanned the trail. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. The descent was slower than I wanted, my legs burning from the constant careful steps. I didn't stop for lunch. I just kept moving until I reached the wider section of trail near the forestry road. When I finally saw my car at the trailhead, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. I signed out in the register, noting the time. As I closed the metal box, I glanced at the previous entries again. The last one before mine was from 7 months earlier. The hiker's name was listed, along with a note. Intended route, same ridge trail to the lake. Next to it, in a different handwriting, was a short note in red ink. Did not return. I woke up early that morning, long before the sun was fully over the hills, because I wanted to get started before the heat of the day. The small cabin I was renting for the week was quiet except for the faint creak of the old wooden floor when I walked. I made coffee and drank it slowly while looking at the topo map spread out on the kitchen table. The trail I had chosen was marked in faint red pencil, a loop that cut through a remote stretch of forest before climbing toward a ridge and circling back. The map was old, edges curled, and I noticed there were some faded marks where the lines weren't very clear. It didn't bother me much. I had done plenty of hikes before. I packed my day bag carefully. 1.5 liters of water in a hydration bladder, another 0.5 liter in a bottle, a couple of granola bars, trail mix, a small first aid kit, my phone with a power bank, a light windbreaker, and a headlamp. The headlamp was probably unnecessary for a day hike, but I took it anyway. My boots were broken in from years of use, the laces rough from so many hikes. The plan was to be out for about 8 hours, back at the cabin by late afternoon. The dirt road to the trailhead was narrower than I remembered from the satellite view. Small stones rattled under the tires, and the trees grew in close, their branches making shadows that moved over the hood. When I pulled into the empty gravel lot, I cut the engine and just sat there for a moment. There was no one else around, no cars, no sound but the faint movement of leaves in a light wind. I felt that small, quiet thrill of being completely alone in a huge space. The first section of the trail was wide, a mix of packed dirt and scattered roots. My boots made a dry, steady sound as I walked. I passed the wooden sign with faded paint, barely readable, and followed the trail markers nailed into tree trunks. The air smelled like damp leaves and pine. Sunlight came through in broken strips, hitting the forest floor in uneven patches. I moved at a comfortable pace, not rushing, breathing evenly. About 40 minutes in, the trail narrowed and the ground began to climb. The incline wasn't steep yet, but I could feel the muscles in my calves working harder. I adjusted the straps of my pack so it sat snugly against my back. At one point, I stepped over a small fallen log and noticed fresh claw marks in the bark, probably from a black bear looking for insects. They were shallow but recent. It reminded me that I was far from town, far from help if something happened. I didn't let the thought sit too long. After another hour, the trail curved sharply and crossed a shallow stream. I stepped on flat rocks to keep my boots dry. The sound of the water was soft but constant, and it made the forest seem even quieter on either side. I paused there for a minute, drinking from my bottle and watching the ripples move around my boots. Then I kept going, following the red blazes painted on trees every so often. The climb became steeper after that. My breathing was heavier, and sweat gathered under my hat. I moved more slowly, but I kept my rhythm. The ridge was supposed to be the halfway point. From there, the trail would loop back in a long, gradual descent. I checked my watch, just after 11. So far, everything was exactly as planned. Then I saw the fallen tree. It wasn't massive, but it had come down across the trail, blocking the way. I stepped over it easily, but on the other side, the trail markers seemed harder to spot. The red blazes looked more faded, and at one point, I didn't see one for several minutes. I kept walking, thinking it would appear again, but the path under my boots was becoming less distinct. The packed dirt was giving way to loose soil and patches of moss. I slowed, scanning tree trunks ahead for any sign of paint. I finally spotted a red mark, but it looked old, more like a scratch of faded pigment than a clear trail blaze. Still, I headed toward it. The ground sloped upward sharply, and I followed what looked like a narrow track. My legs began to ache from the climb, and I had to stop more often. The sun overhead was bright now, heat building in the air. When I reached what I thought was the top, I realized something wasn't right. The ridge I had pictured from the map was supposed to be wide and flat with an open view. But here, the trees were still close together, and the ground kept rising in uneven humps. I pulled out my phone, opened the map app, and waited. The signal bar flickered, then dropped. No service. The GPS dot appeared for a second, showing me somewhere near the trail, then blinked away again. I zoomed in, but the screen froze. I told myself I wasn't lost, just a little off track. I could always backtrack to the fallen tree. But when I turned to retrace my steps, the ground didn't look the same. The way I had come up was just more trees and slope. I picked what I thought was the right direction and began to descend. The descent was harder than I expected. The slope was loose in places, and my boots slid on dry leaves. I grabbed tree trunks for balance. After 20 minutes, I still hadn't reached the stream crossing, and the ground kept angling downward. My shirt clung to my back with sweat. I took another drink from my bottle and kept moving. Then I saw something ahead, a patch of ground where the leaves were disturbed, almost like something had been dragged through. It was fresh enough that the edges of the marks were still sharp. I stopped, staring at it. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer dragged by a predator. But there was no blood, no fur. The marks just led off into the trees. I didn't want to follow them, so I veered away, keeping to my chosen direction. By mid-afternoon, I knew for certain I was off the trail completely. The forest was dense now, and the light between the branches had changed, more yellow, more angled. I forced myself to slow down. Moving too fast when you're unsure is how you get hurt. I took stock of my water, just under a liter left. Enough if I was careful. I tried to climb a small rise to get a better view, but when I reached the top, all I saw were more trees and ridges stretching out in every direction. No sign of the wide ridge I'd expected, no sign of the trail. My legs were starting to feel heavy, and my boots had rubbed a raw spot on my right heel. I shifted my weight to keep pressure off it. The sound of running water made me stop. I listened carefully, turning my head until I pinpointed the direction. I moved toward it, pushing through undergrowth, ducking under low branches. When I reached the water, it was a narrow stream, moving faster than the one I'd crossed earlier. I crouched to refill my bottle, using the small filter I kept in my pack. I drank deeply, letting the cold water cool my mouth and throat. For a moment, I thought I recognized the shape of the streambed, a twist I had seen on the map. If I followed it downstream, it might lead to the original crossing point. I started walking along the bank, keeping close to the water. But the bank was uneven and slippery. Twice I almost fell in. My legs were trembling from fatigue now, and the shadows were growing longer. I checked my watch. Nearly 5. I had maybe 2 more hours of usable light. I kept going, telling myself I just had to make it to the crossing. But when the stream split into 2 smaller branches, I didn't know which to follow. I chose the larger one, but after another 20 minutes, the water vanished into a tangle of fallen trees and rocks. I couldn't follow it anymore. I stopped there, breathing hard, sweat cooling on my skin. My shirt stuck to me, and I could feel the first edge of panic pressing in. I forced myself to sit on a flat rock, take off my pack, and eat a handful of trail mix. I needed to think. I knew enough about hiking to understand that moving in the wrong direction at this point could mean spending the night in the forest. The air cooled quickly as the sun dropped lower. A light wind moved through the leaves, and somewhere far off, I heard a single sharp crack, like a branch snapping. I stayed still, listening, but the sound didn't come again. I decided to find a place to stop for the night. I picked a spot slightly uphill from the stream, where the ground was flat enough to sit. I cleared leaves and sticks, making a small area where I could sit with my back against a tree. I put on the windbreaker, drank the last of my filtered water, and waited as the forest shifted into evening. Dark came faster than I expected. The last light drained from the sky, and the air turned cold. I turned on my headlamp, the beam catching on nearby branches. Every sound was louder now, the creak of wood, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. I kept still, conserving energy. My mind kept replaying the choice points of the day, wondering where I'd gone wrong. At some point in the night, I woke with a start. My headlamp had gone dim, and I could hear movement nearby. Slow, deliberate steps in the leaves. My heart pounded in my ears. I gripped the small folding knife in my pack, not moving, just listening. The steps came closer, then stopped. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and fast. Then, after a long pause, the sound moved away, fading into the dark. I stayed awake until the faint light of dawn. When morning came, I started walking again, moving slowly.